Welcome children to our next session. We were discussing about pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Pollination, as we have already studied, transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or different flowers but of the same species. Flowers are pollinated by the agents of wind, insects, animals, water, then humans also. Got it? So flowers pollinated by insects, that process is called as entomophily, and the flowers are called as entomophilous. What are the characteristics of the flowers? The flowers are brightly colored, attractive, large in size, tubular. The petals are tubular, and they have a sweet fragrance so that the insects are attracted towards it. Flowers pollinated by water. The type of pollination is hydrophily, Phily, and the flowers are known as hydrophilous, Philous. So what is the characteristics of those flowers? The flowers usually have stamens which are very long, so that the anthers, they hang out of the petals and they can detach from the stamens and move towards the female flowers. Clear? So we have the examples: water hyacinth, water lily. Flowers pollinated by wind. The type of pollination is anemophily, and the flowers are called as anemophilous. So what is the characteristics of the flowers? The flowers, they need not be brightly colored. They are usually white in color, and the pollen grains, that is the anthers, are produced in large numbers. The anthers are loosely attached to the stamens, so that when there is a slight wind or a breeze, the anthers, when they become mature, they can detach from the stamens and move along with the air currents and get deposited on the suitable flower of the same species. Now, after pollination, the next important process is fertilization. So, before fertilization, pollination is a must. Got it? Now, what is fertilization? Fusion of male and female gamete. The process is called as syngamy, and the product is called as zygote. Now, what do we mean by male and female gamete? In a flower, the male gamete is pollen grain and the female gamete is ovule. So, when they fuse, they form the zygote, which develops into embryo. Clear? Here is the diagram of pollination and fertilization. The diagram is not that much clear, but anyway, when the pollen grains are, that is anthers, are deposited on the stigma of the flower, this is stigma, style and ovary. This is the anther lobe, and the filament, you can see it is very long. So when the anthers are deposited on it, the pollen grains are dispersed on it, and one of the pollen grain gets germinated and move along this thin filament-like structure, tube-like structure called as style, to reach the ovary. The diagram, I can show you here. You see the pollen grain, as they move down the style, this is the pollen tube. Got it? The pollen grain germinate and forms the pollen tube and move towards the embryo sac. This outside is the ovary, and this is the ovule, which divides to form 7-cell structure. The middle one is the egg cell, the other two synergids. This is the polar nuclei, and these are the 3 antipodal cells. So when the pollen grain reaches the ovule, that is the embryo sac, it divides into 2 male nuclei. One of the male nuclei will fuse with the egg cell, forming zygote. The process is called as syngamy, while the second male gamete will move upwards and fuse with these 2 polar nuclei. What they will develop into? They will develop into secondary nucleus or endosperm. Got it? To provide food, they store reserve food to provide the growing embryo, that is the zygote, which will develop into embryo. What happens to this? These synergids, they die off, antipodal cells die off. So after fertilization, what do we find? We find that the sepals, this is the sepals, the petals, the anthers and the stigma style all fall off. Only the zygote remains. So underline in your book this, that is the petals, sepals, stamen, style and stigma are withered off or die off. Ovary will develop into fruit, this outer part, and the ovule will develop into seeds. Clear? The food is stored. The embryo may contain one or two cotyledons in which food is stored. So in some flower, that is in some seeds, the food is provided stored in the cotyledon, while in monocots the food is stored in the endosperm. So this is the flow chart of how the process of fertilization takes place in plants. You should remember all these points. Clear? Now come to artificial pollination. What is artificial pollination? Pollination, that is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, takes place artificially by human beings. The steps are emasculation, bagging and hybridization. What is emasculation? In this process, what happens? Two flowers are taken. Clear? Let me show you. See, two flowers are taken. I am just showing the rough diagram. Got it? This is the anthers. Got it? Now what happens? You have the petals. Now these anthers, that is along with the stamens, they are being cut off. What you are taking? You are taking two variety. Suppose rose variety or any flower of two different variety but of the same species. In the first step, emasculation, what happens? The stamens along with the immature anthers are cut off. Only what remains? Stigma, style and ovary. Now what happens? This particular stigma, style and ovary, it is not, fertilization has not taken place. It is covered with a polythene bag or plastic called as bagging. Third step is hybridization. What happens? Anthers of the desired flower are deposited on the stigma of the desired flower having stigma, style and ovary. Got it? And after that, after fertilization, the seeds which are formed, when you grow it into the soil or plant, sow it in the soil, it will develop into a new plant which have the desired qualities of both. Got it? So this is how artificial pollination takes place. So it has been possible to form the new varieties of rice, wheat, maize and mango. So all these terms which I have marked, you should remember. What is emasculation, what is bagging, what is hybridization, and what do you mean by hybrid. So remember the examples of the hybrid variety of rice, wheat, maize, mango. This can come in choose the odd one, giving reasons. Got it? So this is artificial pollination. Now, like I will repeat it again. What happens? Emasculation, the stamens are removed. Got it? Along with the anthers. Only the female part is left. Now the anthers of desired flower are deposited here. Before that, the female part, the stigma, style and ovary is covered with a polythene bag or a poly bag called as bagging. Now what happens? The anthers of the desired flower are deposited on the stigma. Now what happens? One of the pollen grain will germinate, form the pollen tube, move towards the embryo sac and fuse. The male gamete and the female gamete will fuse, forming the zygote, developing into seed. This seed, when it develops, grows into a new plant which will have the desired characteristics of two different varieties. Got it? So this is called as hybridization. Now come to sexual reproduction in animals. All vertebrates, that is and invertebrates, reproduce sexually. So that we'll do in the next class. For today, let us complete up till here. So that's all. Thank you.